In previous videos, we've assumed that each request to a servlet from a given client is completely independent. It doesn't depend on the state of any other request, and there is no need to store any information about past requests once they have been fulfilled. In the real world, though, this obviously isn't the case. Whether it's storing login information, tracking purchase history, or simply completing a single request with multiple parts, there are many situations where the servlet needs to store information about a client across requests. This cannot be done through HTTP alone because it is stateless, so instead we maintain client state within the web application itself. Just like a web context acts as a wrapper and global data store for multiple web applications, a client state or session acts as a wrapper and a data store for multiple client requests. Sessions in servlets are represented by the HTTP session object, which is an object that contains basic information about the session. To access this object, use the getSession method of a request object. This will either return the current session associated with the request, or if it doesn't have a session, this will create a new one. Once a session has been created, you can associate object-valued attributes with it. Similar to a web context, these attributes are accessible by any component. This time, though, the component must both belong to the same web context and be handling a request within the same session. Associating an object with a session also allows you to notify that object of certain session-related events. If the object implements the HTTP session binding listener interface, then it will be notified whenever it is added to or removed from a session. Objects can also implement the HTTP session activation listener interface, which notifies them when the session is activated or stored. Through these methods, it's easy to design objects that will respond in useful ways to their associated sessions. So far, we know how to create a session and how to use it effectively, but how can we close a session when its functions are complete? As it turns out, there is no explicit way to close a session because an HTTP client doesn't have a function that will signal if and when it's no longer needed. Instead, each session has a timeout parameter. Basically, anytime a session is not accessed for a certain amount of time, it will be closed and its resources will be reclaimed. The timeout period can be accessed and changed via the getMaxInactive interval and setMaxInactive interval methods. This setup obviously presents certain challenges. If a request takes too long or a session isn't called for a while, it could time out prematurely and lose data for your client. To alleviate this danger, it's a good idea to set your servlet to periodically access the session with service methods as it runs. Anytime a service method is called, it will reset the session's time to live counter. On the other hand, if you know that your session will be complete by a certain point, you can call the invalidate method to invalidate the session and remove any session data. Now that we've covered the basic structure of a web context and a client state, let's get into some actual coding and apply this knowledge to our servlet.